Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to Evolving Consciousness. Thank you for your time on my video. And in today's video, we are going to talk about the eternal quest. Yes, you heard that right, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to talk about the quest which every human being is in, consciously and unconsciously. Every human being, right from childhood to old age, is on a voyage to seek that one thing. That one thing is something which captivates our attention. Some are conscious of it and some are unconscious of it. Before I spell out that one word, I would like to give you a parallel narrative and some background. Because when I'm going to spell out that one word, some of you might vehemently oppose. The reason you might vehemently oppose is because the meaning of this word is probably not well understood, and probably most of us have a very superficial understanding of this word. Now, to give credits to the content of my today's video, I would like to talk about this phenomenal book called The Freedom from the Known by Jiddu Krishnamurthy. Now, my previous video, The Death of Fear, was also inspired from the contents, from the works of this book, and today's video is also inspired from that. What I really loved about Krishnamurthy's works were they were very intellectually stimulating. I mean, to understand his words, to go through his content, you require a different thought process, you require a different mental paradigm altogether. This is not some average self-help book. This is a book which can be only understood with people who have a taste for intellectually stimulating material. This is not a book which will give you an instant dopamine hike, unlike the other motivational books out there. But this is a book which will invite you to dig deep into your own consciousness, to dig deep into different ways of thinking. Or in other words, this book or his work will propel you to sort of disregard all the existing belief systems which you are unconsciously or consciously conditioned throughout your life. Now let us begin with the content. Now I talked about the eternal quest. Now what could be that one thing everyone is chasing? Now some of you might think it's happiness. Even I was of the opinion, I also belong to the school of thought which said that every human being is chasing happiness. But Jiddu Krishnamurthy says that it's not happiness, it is pleasure. Now, as soon as you heard that word pleasure from my mouth, most of you have an opinion about it. Because a layman understanding of pleasure is either through food or through sex. But Jiddu's way of deconstructing this word pleasure is very deep and it's all encompassing. Jiddu says that the word pleasure is not only the physical pleasures which we talk about. Some of the people who are beginners in the field of spirituality, myself included, had a negative perception of this word pleasure. But Jiddu says the things which the spiritualists do, the things of service, the things of meditative practices, they are also bringing about a refined sense of pleasure. What I really love about Jiddu's content, Jiddu's thought process on this word called pleasure, is his non-judgmental attitude. Because oftentimes you would find people talk low of the pleasure, especially from spiritual schools of thought. But Jiddu says, let's examine the structure of pleasure. He says that even spiritualists, even the monks, they are also seeking pleasure. But their pleasure is of a different category. Needless to say that every human being, whether consciously or unconsciously, is seeking pleasure. And now the fun begins, where Jiddu is unraveling the structure of pleasure. He says that there is absolutely nothing wrong in pursuing pleasure, but the problem comes when thought and memory interferes with the pursuit of pleasure. Now the contents of this video would require some amount of pause and introspection, because the words I'm going to talk are the content which is written in this phenomenal book, Freedom from the Known, is not ordinary content, and it's very different from the kind of books which you probably are accustomed to read. Now, Jiddu says that anything which gives you pleasure, it could be a beautiful landscape, it could be pursuing your hobby, it could be eating your favorite dish. All these are different forms of pleasure. And he says that when we take joy, when we are in communion with that particular thing which is triggering pleasure within us, it feels great. He uses this word called delight, because we are absolutely absent from all the anxieties, insecurities and fears for that very moment. Do you know why there are some people who roam around headlessly to great locations so that they feel a sense of pleasure? Because when they witness those views, they can feel a sense of stimulation and they feel great about it. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but the problem begins after that. The problem begins when the person wants to repeat that experience with the same level of intensity, and when thought interferes and tries to create the pleasure which it once experienced and tries to repeat the same level of intensity, that is when all the problem starts. And Jiddu says that when delight is experienced in the present moment, that is the true manifestation of pleasure. But we try to pervert that feeling when we want to headlessly or recklessly wanting to repeat that experience. I would like to read out what exactly he meant by this context, because he has given a beautiful example which is worth of mention to fully understand and digest the content. So let's see what he says here. He says, I see a beautiful motor car, say that then I get a sensation. He's sort of compartmentalizing the process of pleasure through 4 stages. He's saying perception, sensation, contact and desire. He gives a beautiful example. He says, I see a beautiful motor car, say then I get a sensation, a reaction from looking at it, then I touch it or imagine touching it. And there is a desire to own and show myself in it. Or I see a lovely cloud, or a mountain clear against the sky, or a leaf that has just come in springtime, or a deep valley full of loveliness and splendor, or a glorious sunset, or a beautiful face, intelligent, alive, not self-conscious and therefore no longer beautiful. I look at these things with intense delight. He's starting to use that word delight. And as I observe them, there is no observer, but only sheer beauty like love. For a moment, I am absent with all my problems, anxieties and mysteries, and there is only that one marvelous thing. I can look at it with joy and the next moment forget it. And now the fun begins. Or else the mind steps in and then the problem begins. My mind thinks over it, over what it has seen, and thinks how beautiful it was. I tell myself I should like to see it again many times. Thought begins to compare, judge and say, I must have it again tomorrow. The continuity of an experience that has given delight for a second, sustained by a thought. To react is perfectly normal, and he says there is nothing wrong with desire. Now, this is something which is aptly different from the different schools of thought. He says there is nothing wrong with desire. To react is perfectly normal. But then thought steps in and chews over the delight and turns it into pleasure. Thought wants to repeat the experience, and in wanting to repeat that experience becomes mechanical. The more you think about it, the more strength thought gives to pleasure. One thing to note here is he's clearly articulating a distinction between pleasure and delight. He's saying delight is an amazing thing to experience. He's saying that joy or delight is a beautiful thing to experience. But the problem with pleasure is it comes with its mirror reflection. And that mirror reflection is called pain. And let's see what he's saying next. He says, so thought creates and sustains pleasure through desire and gives it continuity. And therefore, the natural reaction of desire to any beautiful thing is perverted by thought. Thought turns it into a memory, and memory is then nourished by thinking about it over and over again. Of course, memory is necessary to function. Now, he is not in any way degrading the importance of memory. Because let's understand, you and me cannot function when we are completely devoid of memory. Memory is essential for survival. But what he's saying or inviting us to consider is, memory sort of serves as an impediment to experience the joy, because the person wants to repeat that experience, and the more he is trying to repeat that experience, the more mechanical it becomes. And it's no longer joy, a delight, but it becomes a laborious experience in itself. And he says that in its own field it must be efficient, but there is a state of mind where it has very little place. A mind which is not crippled by memory has real freedom. Now, this is a very powerful line. A mind which is not crippled by memory has real freedom. I want to just expand on this particular line which I just told. If you look at any problem any human being is plagued with, is an outcome of memory. If you look at the reason for anxieties, the number one reason for anxieties is projection of what has happened in the past and what could happen in the future. The mind always tries to think about the different permutations and combinations and projects it in the future. Now, the foundation for it to project in the future is stored in the memory. And that memory, instead of serving us, creates this nasty horror movies in our mind. And we always are stuck in that anxiety loop as what can happen. And Bhagavad Gita, the Srimad Bhagavad Gita, also addresses this concept so beautifully. And the last chapter of Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna talks about the importance of surrender. Because if you're not surrendering to the present moment, you're not honoring the present moment. Either you're stuck in the ruckus of the past, or you're anticipating a dreadful future. And none of this is going to serve you. And to the contrary, this is going to suck out the life, the joy in the present moment. And he says, have you ever noticed that when you respond to something totally, with all your heart, there is very little memory? It is only when you do not respond to a challenge with your whole being, there is conflict, a struggle, and this brings pleasure, confusion, and pain. And the struggle breeds memory. That memory is added to all the time by other memories, and it is those memories which respond. Anything that is the result of memory is old and therefore never free. There is no such thing as freedom of thought. It is sheer nonsense. Now, this is again a very beautiful concept. Some of us think that we can create new thoughts, new ideas. But if you closely observe and closely contemplate, you will realize that the even so-called creative masterpieces, they are actually nothing new. But they are new ways of connecting old things. Now, what did I say? What did I just say? If you think about it, there is nothing called a new thought. Every thought is essentially old, but you try to connect 3-4 different things in new ways. In that way it became a new thought. But at the very root of it, at a very fundamental or rudimentary level, there is nothing called as a new thought, because thought is a product of memory, and memory is never new. Now, this can be a little hard to digest for someone who's hearing for the very first time, and probably this content is just going off your head, but allow this content to dive into your own mind. Allow to digest it, because this kind of content is very difficult to comprehend at the very first time, because we've been conditioned a certain way. And to understand this, you require a certain level of pause, you require a certain level of contemplation. And he says thought is never new, for thought is the response of memory, experience, and knowledge. He says thought is always a product of these 3 fundamental elements: memory, experience, and knowledge. Thought, because it is old, makes this thing which you have looked at with delight. and felt tremendously for the moment old. From the old you derive pleasure, never from the new. There is no time in the new. Now this is again a very interesting concept. He says, the pleasure is always derived from the old. Delight is derived from the new. So if you can look at all the things without allowing pleasure to creep in, at a face, a bird, the color of a sari, the beauty of a sheet of water shimmering in the sun, or anything that gives delight, if you can look at it without wanting the experience to be repeated. Now here is the crux of the video. He's saying, you look at all the things which are pleasurable to the eye. He's not of the opinion that one should devoid himself from pleasurable things. To the contrary, he's saying that look at everything. Look at, be in the world. He's not suggesting you to cut off from the society or go to the Himalaya to renounce the world. He's suggesting none of that. To the contrary, he's saying, be in the world, be in the material world. See all those things which give pleasure to you. But instead of making that into a rudimentary experience, making it a mechanical experience, instead of wanting to repeat that experience, just look at that thing which is giving you pleasure in the very moment. But the suffering and the pain is inflicted when one is desperate to repeat that experience. He says, if you can look at it without wanting the experience to be repeated, then there will be no pain, no fear, and therefore tremendous joy. Now this is such a powerful narrative, such a powerful deconstruction of this word called pleasure. Because there are two extreme schools of thought when we deal with pleasure. There's one school of thought which says, which is consisting of materialists, they always say, let's enjoy life, one life, let's live it to the fullest, let's indulge in all kinds of pleasures. But if you look at the people who are indulging in all kinds of pleasures, deep within they are painful. Deep within they are not fulfilled. And this is the reason why they roam around headlessly. And there's another spectrum, the next extreme, the other extreme, which says pleasure is bad. You need to stop seeing pleasurable things. But here Krishnamurthy is not subscribing to either schools of thought, either extremist schools of thought, but to the contrary, he's suggesting us to look at the very structure of pleasure. And he says, instead of wanting to repeat that experience, just witness it in the moment. And that witnessing and that complete absorption in the moment is a source of tremendous joy. In the struggle to repeat and perpetuate pleasure, which turns it into pain, watch it in yourself. The very demand for the repetition of pleasure brings about pain, because it is never going to be the same as it was yesterday. Now, this can also be thought about as an example. Let's say you go to a very exotic, beautiful location for a holiday. You really enjoy the breathless beauty Mother Nature has to provide. But what if you come to know that you need to settle there in the mountains? Obviously, for a couple of months you are going to feel captivated by the beauty of that location. But after a few days, monotony or a sense of boredom is going to creep in, because you're going to see the first thing in the morning, you're going to see that, and it's going to be a mechanical experience. And the level of intensity, the intensity of joy you first felt when you first looked at it is obviously not going to sustain. It's going to die down. And when we are wanting to desperately repeat that experience of pleasure at the same level of intensity, that is when we meet with failure, and that failure turns into pain. You struggle to achieve the same delight, not only to your aesthetic sense, but the same inward quality of the mind, and you're hurt and disappointed because it is denied to you. Have you observed what happens to you when you're denied a little pleasure? When you don't get what you want, then you become anxious, envious, hateful. Have you noticed when you have been denied the pleasure of drinking or smoking or sex or whatever it is, have you noticed what battles you go through? And all that is a form of fear, isn't it? You're not afraid of not getting what you want or of losing what you have. You are afraid of not getting what you want or losing what you have. When some particular faith or ideology which you had held for years is shaken or torn away by logical life, aren't you afraid of standing alone? That belief has for years given you satisfaction and pleasure. Because oftentimes when someone hears this word pleasure, he can only think about gross manifestations. But belief systems also give a lot of pleasure. And let's say one fine day that belief system is completely baffled or completely being obliterated or destroyed. Now the source of pleasure was that belief system. But when that belief system is questioned by intellectual thought process, then what happens? We feel stranded, empty, and the fear remains until you find another form of pleasure. Now this is a beautiful way to put it. We hop on from one form of pleasure to another form, from one relationship to another relationship, seeking this very significant aspect which Jiddu Krishnamurthy is no way denigrating or degrading. He says it's important to look at life as it is, and there's nothing wrong in pursuing pleasure. This is a distinct difference in Jiddu Krishnamurthy's thought process and the other spiritualists. He says, it seems to me so simple, and because it is so simple, we refuse to see its simplicity. We like to complicate it. Now this is very interesting, because the simple things are the most worthy of attention. But common sense is not so common these days, and we tend to denigrate the simple things in life. But the simple things, the simple lessons in life are the most worthwhile lessons of life. And he says, when your wife turns away from you, aren't you jealous? Aren't you angry? Don't you hate the man who has attracted her? He gives a very funny connotation, a funny example. And what is all that but fear of losing something which has given you a great deal of pleasure, a companionship, a certain quality of assurance, and the satisfaction of possession? I would like to bring your attention to the kind of pleasures which Jiddu is referring to. He's not talking about only the gross pleasures, he's talking about the subtle pleasures, the emotional comfort, the assurance, the feeling of security that also gives us pleasure. So if we understand that where there is a surge of pleasure, there must be pain. Live that way if you want to. Now he says that you're free to live life the way you want. And like 95% of the world is living, we all can choose to live by that way. But he says, where there is a seeking of pleasure, there must be pain. It's twin brother. I made a video on this concept of pleasure and pain. I call it the PNP code. It's uploaded in my channel. If you are interested to understand that, maybe you can just go and watch that video. And he says, if you want to end pleasure, though which is to end pain, you must be totally attentive to the whole structure of pleasure. So indirectly he's saying that if you want to end pain, you need to end the pleasure aspect of it. Now he's not saying us to deprive ourselves of pleasure. Now the next line he says is very interesting and intriguing. He says, you must be totally attentive to the whole structure of pleasure, not cut it out as monks and sannyasis do. Never looking at a woman because they think it's a sin and thereby destroying the vitality of their understanding. He's saying, unlike monks who think that probably it's a sin and you shouldn't look at it, he says, instead you can try to address it. You can look at this whole system like this and thereby destroying the vitality of their understanding, but seeing the whole meaning and significance of pleasure. Then you will have tremendous joy in life. You cannot think about joy. Joy is an immediate thing, and by thinking about it, you turn it into pleasure. Jiddu heavily advocates each human being to indulge in joy, but the ironical and funny aspect is you cannot think of joy. Joy is an immediate thing. The problem starts when joy converts into pleasure, and that conversion happens, as I talked about in this video, when memory and thought interferes. Living in the present is the instant perception of beauty and the great delight in it without seeking pleasure from it. I hope this video brought a completely different lens of viewing this word called pleasure, because many times we are sort of divided in this dichotomy of these two schools of thought. One school of thought says pleasure is very bad, and one school of thought says pleasure is everything. And Jiddu is cleverly and cunningly being intelligently evaluating both the pros and cons of these schools of thought, and he's giving a very practical and a very deep insight to this whole concept of pleasure. I hope my video made a lot of sense to you, and I hope this inspires interest in you to go through the contents of Jiddu Krishnamurthy's work, because they are not only phenomenal, but they trigger a different thought process within you. They trigger the ability to think beyond words and thoughts and memory. If you really enjoyed this video, don't forget to share this video with a couple of your friends who are also stuck in this eternal quest, whether they are aware of it or not. Also, do provide me your candid feedback in the comment section as to what you felt about the video. Thank you so much, and I'll meet you in the next video. Bye.